Fresh Economic Thinking podcast, new ideas and analysis with Dr. Cameron Murray and Jonathan Gadir.
Hi Cameron, great to talk with you again.
Yeah, it's great to be back chatting again, Jonathan.
And we're back for a new season because you have finally completed the writing of your new book. Is there anything at all you can say about it at this stage?
I can, actually. The book is called The Great Housing Hijack, and you'll be able to buy it pre-ordering in a week or two, and it will be released at the end of February. And it's all about many of the stories and myths in the housing policy debate, and it arms the reader with some better ways of understanding the economics of housing. So I think I would have loved it to be done 6 months earlier, but I think it's much better than it would have been had I rushed it. And I look forward to seeing the responses when it comes out early next year.
I saw some quite kind of funny bickering about when you were saying recently that rents are pretty much the same as a proportion of income, and that upset people.
Yeah, no, that's been one of my big points, that people are complaining about rising rents, but of course the reason rents are rising is predominantly because incomes are rising. And so if you take the rent to income ratio, it's been pretty much a flat line for 25 years or more. And I think we often forget these bigger economic forces at play. We just see what happened in the last 6 months and think that's going to continue forever. So yeah, some people have a bit of trouble digesting the facts and taking a bit of a broader lens to the problem, and that's what the book's all about.
I suppose it doesn't mean that if average incomes are going up, doesn't mean everyone's income's going up. So of course there are going to be some people who are very disadvantaged by rising rents.
Yeah, well, that's the core part of the book, the symmetry of property markets, I call it. That if you own housing, for example, of course, rising rents are great for you if you're a landlord. And so every sort of benefit in the housing market is a cost to someone else, and that really sets the tone for all the political discussions that we have.
All right, so I wanted to start this season off with something that I've noticed out there, because an organisation that I belong to, the Council for Civil Liberties, is actually doing a submission on it, and it's a private senator's bill, which is about climate change and the duty of care we have to future generations. And so it's Senator David Pocock, who's the ex-footballer who won a Senate seat in Canberra in the Australian Capital Territory, and he's got this private senator's bill which is under consideration at the moment. It's before a committee, asking for submissions, and basically it's going to require decision makers to consider, take into account the health and well-being of children in Australia when making significant decisions. And it would require the decision maker, that's the minister usually, not to make significant decisions in relation to the exploration or extraction of coal, oil, or natural gas if the decision poses a material risk of harm to the health and well-being of children in Australia, which to me raises all sorts of interesting questions. I mean, this came about from a federal court case where a bunch of high school kids took the previous government to court, arguing that approving an extension to a coal mine, Vickery coal it was, in New South Wales, that was a breach, that to approve that would be a breach of the duty of care to future generations. And because of the effects of the physical harm that would, in the form of personal injury from climate change, and they asked for basically the court to order that coal mine should not be approved to be expanded. Yeah, and
Wow.
a very adventurous federal court judge at first found in favour of the plaintiffs, of the high school kids, and the minister appealed, and last year was overturned. That judgment was overturned by 3 judges of the full court who agreed with the minister. This was the law of negligence and duty of care was not the way to achieve this result, and there was no duty that the minister had to future generations when we're thinking about approving a coal mine extension. I don't know. I'm always a bit suspicious when we're talking about policy proposals or political programs that are supposed to be, that you're supposed to automatically read off from these very abstract principles, like, human rights or the rights of the child or the right to health, or just really abstract high level things like that. Just the idea that, there's a very specific program or policy agenda that you can just automatically read off from it. I find very unconvincing. I think it's just a trick where you can just import any idea you want and just say, oh, it's because of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And
so is what you're trying to say that there's a gap between the big picture idea of the right and the nuts and bolts implementation of what that means and how to judge whether there's a harm to future generations and how to judge whether what a specific action is related to it. So
too many
these big ideas
variables.
smuggle in. Yeah, they smuggle in almost anything depending on who wants to sort of test out these broadly written laws. Is that the sort of point you're making?
That's one of them. There are others, but I'm just curious about the economist's take on this, because my kind of my opposition to it is kind of unformed. It's not very well defined. So I'd like to know how an economist sees the idea that, oh, we should do X or we shouldn't do X because we think that at some future point that will be a bad thing for generation, such and such.
Yeah. Look, I think mostly economics doesn't deal with uncertainty as well as you'd think. But there are parts of economics that do. And for example, one big debate in economics is the question of discounting the future generations. So even if we know there might be a harm in the future, how do we compare? And another sort of lens of economics that I think is probably relevant here is just quantifying the magnitude of the harm. So typically, economists look at the marginal benefit of, for example, opening that coal mine in terms of the incomes in Australia, however that benefit is distributed, the people who work there, the royalties from extracting the coal, the incomes to shareholders of that company, and how that flows through the economy. So there's a benefit there that needs to be considered. And then there's also a cost. And if you're thinking the cost only in terms of the climate, then you're looking at the marginal cost only, like how much different is the temperature going to be if this coal mine opens compared to if it didn't. And even then, are there offsetting effects? Like if this one doesn't open and maybe the coal price is a fraction higher than it used to be, maybe that's enough to get another potential coal mine in another country out of the ground and make it viable, right? Yeah. And so even step one in any case, they're torts, right? So that's the duty of care and whether someone was negligent and caused harm. This is the sort of class of question we're looking at, right? The first question is determining harm. And here, it's step one is super, super difficult, right? How do you quantify the harm from opening one more coal mine on planet Earth with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of coal mines in 2023 to an Australian child born today who might live another 80 years, and the temperature and the concentration of methane, carbon dioxide, whatever might, is there even a decimal point that shows the difference?
Well, they
and that we could
in that court case that there was a difference, that they said it was a tiny but measurable increase in global average surface temperatures, specifically from the 100 million tons of CO2 that would probably be attributable to burning the coal from the expansion of the coal mine. You know what I mean? Like they were trying that argument.
Yeah, wow.
And I'm just wondering though, like what if there's a technology that's invented that captures the carbon from that technology? I know this is like maybe unlikely, but I'm just trying to see, like, okay, And I know it's a bad argument to say, oh yeah, but like all these other countries around the world are much more responsible than like if everyone makes that argument in the tragedy of the commons scenario, of
Hmm.
course nothing happens, nothing changes. So I know
Hmm.
that what I'm saying is not ethically great. Right?
Look, I think you're right. So economists, your point you just made of what if something changes, right? What if we have a new technology that makes the whole thing redundant? That is a huge question. And that is, a long time ago in economics, there was a debate between what's uncertainty and what's risk, right? What's risk as in terms of the margin of error or the distribution of known outcomes, and what's uncertainty as in the unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
I guess. And the fact that the world exists with unknown unknowns, not just what we know today, and the uncertainty around the measurements of this future harm. But there's also this radical uncertainty or true uncertainty that, you know what, anything could change between now and then. And the longer we wait before imposing costs on ourselves, the more opportunity we have to open ourselves to the positives of that uncertainty, the more opportunities we have to reduce that uncertainty and, try new technologies, try lower cost things before we've committed to it. So the buying time, this is why, for example, in property development, you stage projects into small bits because you want to buy time. You don't want to build it today when the market might change, or you don't know, right? You don't know if the market's going to go up or down. You might know probabilistically, you don't know what people want to buy. So you buy yourself time. You do a little bit now, and then you wait and see if it worked and see if there's anything new that you should incorporate in your decision. And then you go and you do it again. And so I think if you want to deal with this intertemporal duty of care and you don't acknowledge that between now, the action, and 50 or 100 years, the harm, things might change so radically that the harm doesn't exist, or what we thought was a harm becomes a benefit even. I don't think you're having an honest discussion about that. And I'm not saying I know the answer or that we should ignore, irreversible damage to the planet. I'm just saying we need to be honest that this thing called uncertainty exists, and that should make us be more cautious, right? When we try and impose these costs today for very risky and very uncertain and very long-term benefits.
I should also say that this particular bill that we're talking about is probably going to do nothing because all it does is say, even if they pass it, like all it does is say that the decision maker has to consider the well-being and the health of current and future Australian children. So I know what's going to happen. The minister, when faced with a decision, will just go, "Yeah, I considered it. Thanks," and just do the bad decision anyway.
So you're saying, even from a legal perspective, this is written in such a way as to allow no change, but to have the appearance of substantial change, but by being written down, almost opens future other avenues for creative litigation for interest groups.
I don't know.
Do you think?
I just don't know.
I don't
know. We've got an experience already with the human rights compatibility statement. Like every law that the Australian Parliament, every bill that's considered by the Australian Parliament has to be accompanied by a statement of compatibility with human rights. And even the most horrendous what I consider breaches of basic human rights, just sail through with this lovely statement saying it's compatible with human rights. So the minister's going to be like, yeah, I considered all the factors, and I still think that it's beneficial on the whole, even though there might be some downsides.
That gets to sort of another sort of expression of this uncertainty problem, right? The minister's just going to use their judgment at the end of the day, right?
Correct.
I considered it, but in my judgment, I don't either trust this person's claim, or I think, who knows the future, so I'll just discount it in my mind, or I'll internalize this idea of buying time. But there's just fundamentally this, what I would call a knowing question, like, requiring consideration of unknowable things is quite a weird challenge, don't you think? And I like to think, for example, to put it plainly, I don't know what generations 100 years from now in 21, 23 will actually think about the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I don't know if they will even be concerned as we are, given typical improvements in technology and economic development of all sorts. Maybe it's the case there's a hypothetical world where they want higher carbon dioxide concentrations because they're relying on more rapid plant growth to feed themselves. There's a kind of Soylent Green future that could exist. I don't know, where they require that to help with plant growth. And it's easy to see how bizarre this knowing question is. If we cast our mind back 100 years and we're sitting in 1923, roaring 1920s, trying to consider in a legal case in 1923, what's best for the people living in 2023 when it comes to policies around petroleum or mining for gold or anything like that, right?
What was the horses example you talked about?
Imagine in 1923, someone used one of these laws and creatively said, oh, we really need to impose these big costs on society because we need to preserve places for horses to be fed in the cities, because people in 2023, if we don't preserve these places for them now and impose these costs, then people in 2023 won't have anywhere to park their horses or feed their horses in the big cities when the cities grow, right?
Yeah.
So they're sort of extrapolating the current pattern with no change, no uncertainty in 100 years into the future, and saying, look, if we don't do this now, all those people trying to ride their horses around the city in 2023, well, there'll be such big costs on them. It'll stifle their economic growth and well-being that we must consider this today. We have a duty of care, right? It would make no sense. I mean, at the time, we'd only just invented powered flight. No one thought that was possible. We'd only just realized that things called viruses exist. Before that, we didn't even know why people got sick. And we still didn't even know for another decade or more that nuclear fission was possible. And we're expected, we need to be more honest about the limits to our knowledge, that we are living in the 1923 of the next century's generations, where we don't know anything either, and we don't know what they want. And we're here trying to sort of second guess or predict or trick ourselves into knowing what the world's going to be like in 100 years. Yeah. I just find there's some kind of, what would I call it? Confidence trick. There's some kind of snobbery to that I think cannot be justified. If that makes sense.
There's a geographer called Mike Hulme, or I don't know how to pronounce his name, Hulme, and he's got a book out, and he's written a lot of articles on climatism and how climate has become sort of fetishized and sort of narrowly sort of pulled out of context, and also completely overtaken other real ecological concerns. And I could make a very radical ecological argument about, well, why only the human health effects of oil, gas, and coal resulting in increased carbon? Well, what about all the fisheries that are going extinct? What about the loss of animal life and trees that continue to be cut down? Why this one measure? Why only that one? And also, I can see that what it's trying to do is to kind of make some kind of radical systemic change, but because it's trying to do it through the existing parliamentary mechanisms in our liberal capitalist system. So it's this square peg in a round hole. You can't get radical system change from within our current system. So what you do is you pick some technical decision that a minister has to make, and then you create some mechanism that they have to consider X and Y, which doesn't really change anything. It doesn't change the fact that Vickery Coal is out there looking to expand its profits, and there's no mechanism to say, no, sorry, you can't do that anymore. They're not changing company law to say you've got to...
fair enough.
You got to, change
Yeah.
you got to not allowed to, search for expanded profits in ways that
Look,
harm the environment.
I agree that it's a very narrow approach to system change. It's like how do we slide this in somewhere? And I can see it from the perspective of someone who thinks climate change is the number one human concern and daylight second, that intervening in this type of way for your one true cause makes a lot of sense. And I think it would be effective, right? If we said no new coal mines, well, that's a very direct way to have less coal burnt, I think. To be honest, actually, I'm gonna walk that back. It's in a direct way to not have that coal burnt. I'm not sure if there are offsetting effects elsewhere in the world or in the Australian economy. For example, maybe other mines that are approved can mine slightly faster, you see, and if they have enormous reserves, the point in which those reserves become uneconomical and the effect of banning the new one kicks in could be decades away. And then even then, there might be offsetting effects elsewhere in the world, right? I don't think, we can quantify it so easily. The other thing I think from what you just said about these legal maneuvers and these principles we're trying to use, I think if we agree on the principle, shouldn't we apply it to everything, not just coal mines and climate-related costs? Should we not also apply it to the potential benefits of scientific investment? Or if we really want to have a low discount rate, so we really value the future a lot, and we think it's identical to the present, then doesn't that also suggest that nuclear power, where the costs are very present, but the benefits are very far into the future, should get a leg up in this type of assessment? Because, the further in the future your costs are with climate change, we need to discount those future costs less if we want action today, right? But that also means
just explain that discounting idea to me. I find
so
that
discounting
confusing.
basically is how much less should we value, for example, the same production at a future time period today. So if I'm going to, the value of having an extra, cheaper cars today for today's people versus cheaper cars in 50 years for future people. Well, that $100 saving per household today, we know it's worth exactly $100. It can buy exactly $100 worth of other goods and services. But in the future, we don't know what future goods and services people can buy, what they'll have to give up to get it. We also don't know how much they'll desire that option. We don't know if things will change. So discounting just means, how do we package up all that uncertainty about the future and say, well, the future person's probably not worth as much as today's people, because we're not 100% sure that they'll get the benefit. And we do this in all sorts of stuff, right? Like, when you buy a house, you're buying the future infinite flow of benefits from not having to rent, right? For you and your descendants, for the infinite future. But the value isn't infinity, even though the benefits are infinity, because the further ahead in the future we go, the less we account for those benefits today. So discounting is in everything. And one of the tricks as an economist, and all consultant economists know this, is if you have an assessment of the benefit cost of a project, even a road or a public park or a building that might only last 50 years or 100 years, not the climate, which will still be around in 300 years, but it's a long-term but finite period. We know that you spend costs today for benefits in the future, and projects where the benefits are further out into the future can be made more attractive by adding up future benefits and present costs by reducing the discount rate, which means the amount that we discount the future, we make it less. So if the discount rate was 0, we'd count the future exactly the same as today. Right? Yeah. And so if you've got benefits a long way in the future, you bring the discount rate back to 0, it makes today's investment look good compared to one where the benefits are just like next year or the year after. And so it's a real, on most economic assessments, the discount rate is an input, an assumption. And depending on the project you're assessing, if it's got future benefits and a lot of cost upfront, then you reduce the discount rate to make it look better.
Right.
Whereas if the benefits are much closer to today, that if you want that project to look more beneficial, then you increase the discount rate to make that other one that's got a long-term benefit look worse.
No.
So it's a real, you can sort of manipulate it. And so the point being, in the climate debate in particular, people seem to want to have a low discount rate. They want to have future benefits worth quite a lot today to justify action today.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to have future benefits worth a lot to justify costly action today, that's true of other costly things like nuclear power that cost a lot today, but have very long-term benefits. So it actually, there's no internal consistency in the principle or the logic when it comes to climate, right? If the costs are really that bad and really that long, then we should also do the other things like nuclear power, which can get us, quite rapidly off greenhouse gas emitting fuels. But for some reason, that inconsistency just wanders through all these legal cases and never seems to get drawn out.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there for this topic. Could you just tell us, we've got a couple of really interesting topics coming up. Do you want to just flag what they are?
Yeah, I do. So I've got Aidan Morrison coming on soon to talk about the cost of transitioning to renewables and the CSIRO Gen Cost report, and how he's sort of discovered some weird economics and accounting in some of these really key documents that we are relying on to justify these costs of transitioning to renewables. I've got Tim Helm coming on to talk about the big things people misunderstand about property markets and housing. And I've got Leith Van Onselen coming on to talk about international students, population growth, and the state of the policy debate in Australia and the recent trends in immigration policy in Australia, Canada, and the UK, which all seem to be, booming in terms of immigration at the moment, and what he and I think. So that's what's in store for the next month or so.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to see you speak, there's an event called Australians for Science and Freedom Conference, Sydney, November 18, 19. You can find out more on the Australians for Science and Freedom website, scienceandfreedom.org. And I think you're saying this is a new organization. So anything with the word freedom in it in Australia is going to be right of center. Am I right? I would assume so. This is going to be a right-wing group of people, except for you.
Well, I just feel like that's lost all of its relevance, this left and right after COVID. So yeah, the conference is on at the University of New South Wales, 18th and 19th of November. I'll be speaking there on the Sunday afternoon, the 19th, about where does science happen and why. But it's more about the evolution of academic journals and universities, and my take on new opportunities in that area. So there's an array of different speakers. I'll be there.
Yeah.
And
your co-author Paul Freitas.
Paul Freitas will be there.
Yeah.
He's also trying to start a new university for economics and social science. So there's been a real sort of flight away from the established institutions, real decline in trust, and a lot of people from various sides of politics looking for an institutional structure in which to be much more honest about these questions, just like the questions we spoke about today of, is it really possible to make a sensible claim about a duty of care to a generation in 100 years' time through a sort of legal decision or not? And what's a more sensible conceptual basis for making decisions today, acknowledging that, yes, sometimes there might be irreversible costs to the planet and to people. So those, I think, are the types of discussions we'll have. And I do find it quite strange that freedom as a word is associated with the political right, I always imagine, the hippies of the 1960s
used to be different.
with their free love, freedom, man. Let's just
Freedom,
let it all
right,
go, and why stick it to the man. Quite a bizarre one. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So hopefully,
it
some of
sounds
the
really
economic
exciting.
thinking.
Yeah.
Hopefully I can meet some readers there at the event.
Yeah, so come and have a chat to Cameron. That's the selling point. Look forward to seeing you there, and talk again soon.
Okay, talk soon, Jonathan. Bye.